Well, we are, as we've said a number of times now, we're beginning a new series this Sunday for the Sundays leading up to Advent called Jesus in the Book of Numbers. Book of Numbers. I know you may be thinking, awesome. Where's that again? Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. It's a book we often don't spend a great deal of time in. And the first chapters of it are really, honestly, well, they're tough to get through. It's a whole lot of numbers and a whole lot of groups and genealogies, but there's actually a great wealth of material to draw from here, particularly as we think about looking ahead to Advent and how we see Christ through all of the Scriptures. So this coming Advent, beginning today, we'll be starting our series, Jesus in the Book of Numbers. And today, we're going to look specifically at Numbers 24. Numbers 24, beginning at verse 15. It's on page 115 if you're using this Brown Pew Bible. And once you've found that, I wonder would you turn there with me and let's stand together. I want to read through this together, get it into our minds and hearts, and then we'll see what God has to say to us from this. Numbers chapter 24, beginning at verse 15. Then he, that is Balaam, uttered this oracle. The oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of the one whose eye sees clearly, the oracle of the one who hears the words of God, who has the knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision of the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the sons of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered, but Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. This is God's word. You may be seated. Pray for us as we begin. Living God, we come now to hear from your word. We have been told that this word is living and active, and it pierces even to the very bones and marrow. Nothing is hidden from you. And we ask that you would lay us bare this morning. As we come to your word, would you pierce to the very places where we need to hear from you, O God? We need to meet with you, for we are living in a land of darkness as well, and we need your great light to shine into our hearts. I ask that you would open up each of our ears to receive what you want to say to us individually this morning, right where we're at. And I pray that we'd be changed by what we hear this morning. We would come out different than when we came in. And I ask, eternal God, as always, would you move and govern my tongue to speak your truth? Amen. All right. I want you to come with me. I want you to imagine yourselves for a moment. You're in a warm, cozy living room. Okay? There's a fireplace is roaring over here. You're sipping eggnog gingerly. You're rocking the crispest Charlie Brown soundtrack in the background, and you've just set up a beautiful cultured Christmas tree in the living room. It's filling the room with a scent of pine. What would you say is the one thing that would just fire a rocket launcher of conflict and disunity right into the middle of this otherwise happy scene of Norman Rockwell-esque kind of scene of setting up the Christmas tree, decorating the Christmas tree? What do you think it would be? What's going to do it? I'll help you out. It's deciding who gets to put the star on top of the Christmas tree. Who gets to put the star on? Now, if you're smart, you will just set it up right from the beginning. Just, make putting the star on top of the tree just a kind of a patriarchal, high priestly role of the father. Each year, once the Christmas tree is decorated, Dad gets to put it on. Just do it and be done with it. But if you're like the rest of us, and you've made the classic blunder of choosing one child each Christmas to put the star on top, unless you've got an amazing memory and have some way to prove that your memory is right, or I don't know, maybe you just got one kid, you know that scene is going to go quickly from Norman Rockwell to the Hunger Games like that. Okay, your sweet little angel that wants a My Little Pony for Christmas, she's going to go all Katniss Everdeen on her sisters, and it's not going to be pretty. Because the star is a big deal, right? It's one of the defining symbols of the whole season of Advent. And it's for most of us, this great star that shone over the place in Bethlehem where Jesus was born, that we read about at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, it's a big deal. I mean, we also read about in Matthew's gospel, right, this story of the wise men coming from the east. They see this star and they come to worship this newborn King of the Jews. I mean, we'll see this acted out in Christmas plays all around the world this time of year by kids, with tea towels on their head, coming to worship the plastic baby Jesus. And it's going to be amazing. We're going to love it. But that's the thing, right? I mean, it's all really, familiar to us, isn't it? This story of a star over Bethlehem, it just kind of melts into yet one another of the many familiar Christmas details of the story. We'll see it on Christmas cards or in a Christmas play, and we'll just be like, yeah, that's what happened. Star, manger, wise men come, worship, yeah. That's pretty much how it went down. No big deal. I mean, we might describe the star as iconic, but certainly probably not that important at the end of the day, and certainly not bringing any hope whatsoever. And hope for the people of Israel then, as well as for us today, is something we're all desperate to find. But what if I told you that there's actually a great deal of hope to be found in these familiar, seemingly meaningless details? Would you trust me enough to come and investigate a little deeper? Because my contention is that we find these details familiar and utterly meaningless because we simply haven't understood them yet. That's all. I mean, if I were to ask you this morning, why was it a star that marked the place where Jesus was born? Or why was Herod and all Jerusalem disturbed by the coming of these wise men from the east to worship this king who was born under the star? Or most importantly, what does any of this have to do with us today? I wonder how many of you would be able to answer me. I gotta confess, I didn't even really know before I started preparing this message. Well, I believe the answer to those questions is found here in our passage in the book of Numbers, chapter 24. This oracle or prophecy from Balaam, a prophet for hire who's been hired by the king of Moab to curse Israel, but who ends up speaking a blessing over them instead. And not only do I want us to see why this star is so important, I want us to see, I'm praying we'll also see how this great star of Christmas points to the greater star of Christmas, a star that shines not by the reflected light of the sun, but with heaven's own light. For it's there in that greater star that the real hope is to be found. So, here's what we're going to do this morning. I need to take just like 2 or 3 minutes to kind of set the context, help us understand what's going on with this guy Balaam and all this story here. But then I want us to focus the rest of our time on just 2 things this morning. Who the greater star is and why the greater star shines. That's it, 2 things. Who the greater star is, why the greater star shines. So if you closed your Bibles, please open them up again. I want you to look at this with me. Numbers 24, and let's get after this together. Okay, so the context quickly, just so we can understand where we're at. Historically, where we're at is the people of Israel have just come out of Israel. They've been freed from slavery in Egypt, and they're following Moses, Charlton Heston or pretty soon Christian Bale. They're following Moses through the wilderness, defeating kings and kingdoms by God's power as they make their way towards the promised land. And now they're camped right on the banks of the Jordan River, which is just opposite of the land of Canaan, this promised land that's been promised to them. Now, unsurprisingly, Israel is making quite a name for itself as it travels through the wilderness defeating kingdoms. We saw a few weeks back that when Israel eventually crosses the Jordan River and defeats the city of Jericho, that the people of Jericho also had heard about Israel. Remember the report from Rahab, the prostitute who hid the Hebrew spies who were checking out the land. We hear that even Jericho has heard about Israel defeating these kings and kingdoms, and they're terrified. Well, another king that is equally terrified of Israel is the king of Moab, Balak. And he's so terrified that he hires this prophet Balaam to come and curse the people of Israel so they won't be able to keep going through the land defeating kings and kingdoms, mostly so they won't be able to defeat his kingdom. And there's a lot of strange interactions that happen between Balak and Balaam. We don't have time to get into that this morning. I guarantee if you grew up in church and Sunday school, you already know about Balaam. He's this prophet that had a close encounter of a donkey kind, where God spoke through the donkey to rebuke him. It's just 2 chapters back in Numbers 24. It's a crazy story. Don't go there now, but read it sometime. It really is interesting. The sum of the story is this. Although Balak has hired this prophet to come and curse Israel, each time God speaks a prophecy of blessing through Balaam instead, which is understandably frustrating to the king of Moab. And so there's these series of 4 oracles or prophecies that Balaam is given, that receives from God and then tells to Balak. And it's the 4th oracle here in Numbers 24 that we're going to focus on this morning. So look at it with me. In these first few verses, 15 and 16, basically what Balaam is saying here is that he's receiving these messages from God. These oracles or prophecies are coming from God. You see, he says in verse 16, the one who hears the words of God or has the knowledge from the Most High. So he's saying, I'm hearing this from God. And then in verse 17, look with me now, he uses these words of a star and a scepter. He talks about this star and a scepter that will rise out of Jacob and Israel. And then finally, in verses 18 and 19, if you look here, he says some pretty troubling words if you happen to be a Moabite or an Edomite. Now, I realize we can't even go ahead one step here because I need to deal with the fact that some of you in here, whether you're a Christian or not, are thinking, come on, about oracles and prophecies, hearing voices that tell you what to say and do, and did I come to Harry Potter Baptist Church this morning? I mean, you expect me to accept this? I would answer you no. No, not necessarily. All I'm saying at this point is that this guy, Balaam, here is claiming that he's hearing these messages from God. That's what he's claiming. But given the fact that in Balaam's day, if something a prophet said didn't come true, that he would be stoned to death, I'd say we have pretty good reason to believe that at least he's not just whipping this off the top of his head. Right? He's got sufficient motivation not to lie. But what's really cool is that before we even get into anything else, already we're seeing a cause for hope. Because, look, remember, Balak has hired Balaam to come and curse Israel, but God completely flips it and makes Balaam bless Israel instead. So already we can see that for God's people then, as well as for us today, God's protection over us can turn even the evil intentions of people against us into blessing. And that's a cause for hope. Now, there's a lot more that we could say here, but that gives us enough of a picture anyway to see where we're at, and we can kind of see who the big players are and the when and the where of our passage. But now I'd like us to focus specifically on this oracle and prophecy itself in the first half of verse 17. Look at it with me. Balaam says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. Okay, so, Sorry, what? I know, it feels a bit like we're back in English Lit class now, and we're talking about poetry or Shakespeare, and that feeling of your temples tensing up like someone's tightening a vice around your head is returning. I get that. And if you're an impatient person like me, you're probably saying, well, why doesn't he just say what he wants to say without these ribbons and bows? Just say it, dude. Well, just bear with me. Just tough it out for a minute. I mean, believe me, I'm going easy on us this morning. If you've ever read apocalyptic prophecy, like in Daniel or Revelation, where there's like creatures with 7 heads and horns coming out of their heads, and then a little tinier horn coming out of that horn and talking, like, that's right? Okay, so this is Sesame Street compared to that. You're going to be okay. The thing we focus on is what Balaam keeps seeming to be referring to as the someone or something specifically. He keeps talking about seeing him, beholding him. Right? And then he describes this person as a star and also as a scepter. And all these things I'm going to try to show are referring to the greater star of Christmas. So the first thing I want us to consider is who the greater star is. Who the greater star is. Now, considering this entire series is called Jesus in the Book of Numbers, it's probably not going to become a big surprise to anyone. No one's going to be shocked by hearing me say that I think this someone that Balaam is referring to, the scepter and star imagery, is Jesus. I mean, we've got that part. What I want to do is spend a few minutes just talking about why I think it's Jesus. Why I think it's Jesus. So right from the beginning of the first chapters of the Bible, in the very same moment when things go really bad for Adam and Eve and consequently for the rest of humanity, when Adam and Eve sin and bring sin into the world, right in that moment, God makes a promise that this one would come, this seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15, who would come and defeat Satan and restore mankind and creation back to himself. That seed is Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the rescuer who would accomplish this restoration. And so from that point in Genesis 3 forward until the New Testament, when Jesus does come, the Old Testament is just littered with these signposts and markers to remind Israel, hey, don't forget, this Messiah is coming. He's coming. And some of those signposts are these prophecies about this coming Messiah, like we have in our passage this morning. And so I want us to look for a moment at actually just one of the other well-known prophecies, probably the most well-known prophecy of this coming Messiah, aside from this one in the book of Numbers, in Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9, and I'm going to show then quickly that how the New Testament is going to confirm these prophecies are talking about Jesus. So keep your finger here. Turn ahead for a moment to Isaiah chapter 9. It's on page 489 if you're using this brown Bible. Isaiah chapter 9. Beginning at verse 2, on page 489. Look at this with me. Here Isaiah says, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those who live in the land of shadow of death, a light has dawned." Okay, so here Isaiah is referring to someone or something with these rescuing revelation type terms, with the image of a great light. Now, this isn't, in the Hebrew, the sense of this isn't just, some light you're going to see in the night. The sense in the Hebrew is an extraordinary light, a remarkable light, unlike anything else you've seen. Okay, so as we think about the Christmas story that we've heard so many times throughout our lives, Matthew's Gospel, Luke's Gospel, we've heard this story. Is that starting to ring any bells for anyone? Can anyone else think of any other extraordinary lights that shine in the night sky? When the wise men, who were likely astrologers among many other things, show up in Jerusalem, they tell Herod, "We have seen his star in the east," which means that of all the other stars in the sky, there was this one remarkable, extraordinary light that shone there that stood out from all the rest. It also tells us that they knew it was a sign that pointed to a specific person. Remember, the wise men say, "We saw his star." And if you look down in verse 6 of Isaiah chapter 9 and following, we'll see this time we're left with no doubt about who this great light is. Isaiah writes, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given." You're probably hearing Handel's Messiah in your head right now. "And the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." So what Isaiah does here is he connects this imagery of a great light with the person of Jesus Christ. And he says these are one and the same thing. They're the same thing. We see this now confirmed in tons of places in the New Testament. I'm going to just point out one or two here. For instance, in Luke 2, verses 29 and 32 to 32. You don't have to turn there. I'll read it for you. When Jesus is brought to the temple to be dedicated, as all firstborn males were, to be dedicated to God according to the law, they bring the baby Jesus to the temple, and this man, Simeon, takes Jesus and says this prophecy as he holds him and looks at the baby Jesus. Listen. "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people." Now listen, "a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to the people of Israel." So here, again, The Bible is connecting the imagery of a great, extraordinary light and connecting it directly to the person of Jesus. It's saying these are the same thing. We're trying to draw all these strings together all through the Bible. It is all connected piece. And lastly, we'll talk about the Apostle John. He says very explicitly, 1 John 1:5, God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all. Or in John's Gospel, the famous first chapter, when he's speaking of the Word becoming flesh, he writes, in him, that is Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Let's turn back to Numbers 24. Like so many other signposts in the Old Testament, God uses the imagery of one thing to point to a future greater reality, something different. In verse 17 of Numbers 24, it's a star. But there's many other signposts like this in the Old Testament that use this same type of imagery. Well, one would be something like the Passover lamb in the book of Exodus. You remember, in the last plague that God brings on the land of Egypt, he sends the angel of death through the land that will kill the firstborn child of everyone in the land. But he gives Israel this sign that will protect them from the coming judgment. They are to take a spotless lamb, kill it, and then put the blood on the doorposts of their home. So when the angel of death passes through the land, he will see that sign and pass over that home. The judgment will pass over it, which, by the way, is where we get the term Passover from, if you didn't know. The sign God gives them of a lamb, it has a present reality, right? They really do kill a lamb, and it really does protect them from their firstborn dying. But it also points to a future, greater reality when the person of Jesus Christ, this greater star of Christmas, who Revelation calls the Lamb who was slain, who the Apostle Paul calls Christ our Passover Lamb. It points to a future reality when Jesus Christ will come and offer himself, be sacrificed himself, so that we can escape from God's judgment. In the same way, the star had a present reality to it. The wise men literally followed a star to the sky in Bethlehem. But even they knew they weren't coming to worship a star. No, the star was only pointing to an even greater reality, this greater star of Christmas. The Messiah, the one whom they say to Herod, they say, we've come to worship this one who has been born King of the Jews. This is also why in Numbers 24, we see in verse 17, Jesus is also referred to as a scepter. He's referred to as a star and now a scepter. This staff that signifies absolute authority and sovereignty of a king. For Jesus comes not just as the light of life, as John calls him, to shine into our darkness, but he also comes as the King of glory. Remember, the prophecy that we read in Isaiah 9 speaks of Jesus as this great light who will also rule eternally on David's throne. All the strength of the government and ruling authority will be on his shoulders. And along with this, scholars tell us that it's almost certain that these oracles that Balaam prophesies were recorded in numerous places, many places, not just here in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is why scholars also tell us that the wise men who followed this extraordinary sky and this star in the skies knew that they weren't just coming to witness an interesting event. They knew specifically they were come to worship the birth of a king. So the great hope that we find in this relatively unknown oracle in the book of Numbers is that this same Jesus, whose birth we celebrate this Advent season, is not only the greater star of Christmas who shines into the darkness of our lives with his light of life, he's also the King who rules with power and authority for all eternity. Come, let us adore him. But here's a big question. It's a big question on my mind. Perhaps it's on your mind as we talk through all that. So what? So what? Okay. So Jesus is the greatest star of Christmas. Great. Great. That's awesome, Pastor. Great. But guess what? I just got laid off a month before Christmas, and if I can't find work, my family's going to probably be out on the streets by the new year. Or that's great, Pastor. Jesus is the greatest star of Christmas. Our baby died a week after childbirth, and even though it's been a year, we still can't take down the nursery, and we still cry ourselves to sleep every night. Or my marriage is falling apart. Or my daughter has anorexia and I'm watching her starve herself to death in front of me. Or I'm so depressed I can barely find the strength to get out of bed in the morning. So what? What does any of this have to do with me right now? Where's the hope that you said we were going to find in these seemingly meaningless details? Because from where I'm sitting, they still just look meaningless. I'll tell you, if the message were to end here, okay, we go to some obscure Old Testament prophecy and I pull Jesus out of the prophecy like some rabbit out of a hat. Ta-da! It's Jesus. And we sing a hymn from hymn book and we go get lunch. And if we end like that, I don't even know how to answer the questioner's question. One of the greatest contributing factors to the idea that Christianity is an irrelevant, useless waste of time for everyone who's got more than an elementary school education is the pervasive belief that the Bible has nothing to say to us today in our present circumstances. You hear that? The greatest contributing factors to the idea that Christianity is irrelevant and utterly useless to everyone who's out of kindergarten is the idea that the Bible doesn't say anything to us right now. And one of the joyful burdens of a pastor on a weekly basis is not just to show you true things about Jesus, but to show you why it matters for us today. To inspire hope in all of us by showing you that these true things about Jesus speak to the real life struggles and circumstances we face today, right now. And by God's grace, that's what I intend to do here as we look now at our second point, why the greater star shines. Why the greater star shines. Now, sometimes people use cliches when they're trying to describe something or make a point. Someone will say something like, he just can't see the forest for the trees. And I got to admit, I've never fully understand how that expression makes sense. I assume, I gather what people mean is that someone is so close to something, so focused on this one thing, in this case a tree, that they can't see the bigger picture, the forest, as it were. That's probably what they mean. For me, someone who uses Google Maps a lot, maybe you do, an image that makes a bit more sense to me, and maybe to you, is to think of it this way. If I'm searching through downtown Vancouver on the street level view, do you know where you just look around on the street level? And if I'm trying to find my way from downtown Vancouver to highway number 1 so I can get out of Vancouver, well, man, it's going to be vastly more simple to find my way if I zoom out, right, scroll back, zoom out, and now I can see all of Vancouver, even a little bit of the ocean, and now I see, okay, take Georgia, here's Lionsgate Bridge, loop-de-loop, I'm on Highway 1. Awesome. So much easier. Well, we need to do the same kind of zoom out from our story here, from just being so close up in the grill of Balaam and Balak. We need to zoom out so we can see what's actually going on here and what's going on in the bigger picture of Israel's history. So we can even understand what all of this means to God's chosen people then, as well as us today. So remember, we said at the beginning of this, Israel's been led out of their bondage of slavery in Egypt. They've been wandering around in the wilderness for about 40 years now, and they're camped just above the borders of Moab and just on this side of the Jordan River with Canaan over here. This is the promised land that God has led them to. Now, the zoomed out view is essential. We need to keep coming back to the bigger picture because that's going to help us understand what any of this means today. Because once we see this brief snapshot from above, now when we kind of scroll over and zoom back in to Balaam and this prophecy, we can see why the greater star is shining, what the meaning of it is now. And we see it in the second half of verse 17. Look at it with me. Balaam says of this star, this scepter, he will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the sons of Sheth. Edom will be conquered, Seir, his enemy, will be conquered, but Israel will go strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. Now, I know I don't need to tell you why that's not good news if you happen to be a Moabite or an Edomite. But the question I brought up at the beginning of our sermon here, by the way, this second half of verse 17 is why Herod and all Jerusalem are disturbed by the coming of the wise men who are following this star to worship this king of the Jews. Because guess who King Herod is? An Edomite. King Herod is an Edomite, and it's clear that he's heard about this prophecy before. And that's why he orders the slaughter of all the Hebrew male babies under the age of 2, because he knows if this prophecy of Balaam is right, it's going to go really bad for him. But you see, on the other hand, why this would be such good news to the people of Israel as they are about to enter into this land that God's promised them. It's the promised rest, as Hebrews calls it. God's hope-filled promise to Israel is, I'm not just going to give you this land across the Jordan. I've promised you that, yes, but when this Messiah comes, this one who will come from among you, when he comes, I will also utterly remove all the other surrounding threats, these nations that would come against you to attack you, Moab to the south of you, and Edom to the south of the land of Canaan. It's a promise of utter and complete salvation and redemption for God's people. See, this is the hope of that greater star that Christmas brings. It's a hope, not that removes Israel or us out of difficult circumstances, but a hope that absolutely carries us through. It's a hope like a graduation that gets us through the hours of studying and exams and papers. It's a hope like holding your child in your hands for the first time that gets you through the pain of childbirth. And just like we said before, in the Old Testament, things like the Passover lamb and even this image of a star are pointing to something greater. So this grand story of a people group redeemed by God out of slavery and about to enter a promised land of rest, while maintaining its historical reality, this really happened in history, it also points us to a greater future reality. A future reality that includes you and me and everyone else who has put their faith in Jesus and has been adopted into this grand, pan-historical, pan-cultural people of God. I mean, just listening to a story about a people chosen by God, rescued out of slavery, who are still waiting the realization of that full promise of redemption and restoration. Does that sound familiar to anyone? If you know Jesus as your Savior this morning, this is your story as well. We are a blood-bought people, sons and daughters who've been rescued from their bondage to sin, but who still struggle under the threat of attack, things that the enemies that come against us every day as we wait the fulfillment of God's promised redemption, when Jesus will come again and set up his promised land for us here on the earth. It's absolutely where we are, right here, right now. And I think then understanding all of that brings us to very relevant applications to our lives today. A word of hope and a word of exhortation. One of the great difficulties, first of all, when we think about the hope, is that these people rescued out of the land of slavery, but they've been wandering around for 40 years in the desert, burying their relatives and loved ones in the desert, under constant threat of attack from everyone. One of the great difficulties for them is to remember this promised land, the hope of the promised land, that it really is coming. And for many of us this morning, straining under the weight of life and the devastating, unceasing waves of pain and discouragement, we need to be reminded that all those things, first of all, which come against us, have ultimately already been defeated in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that greater star of Christmas. That's what he came to accomplish. That's why Paul tells us, if God is for us, who can be against us? We also find hope in being reminded that there truly is a coming rest from our struggles, because we live in what theologians call that already not yet of the kingdom of God. We need to be reminded there's a future day when that same greater star will renew all things again. He will come and set up his kingdom on earth. So we can find present strength now in the difficulties and the terrors that come against us now, presently, so that we can see that future day when, as the scriptures tell us, all sorrow and mourning will flee away. The redeemed of the Lord will return and come with singing unto Zion, that great city of God, and everlasting joy will be upon their heads. The hope of our passage for us today, as well as Israel then, is don't give up. Don't give up. I'm leading you to your ultimate rest, Jesus says. And you're almost home. Almost home. But as well as a word of hope, there's also a word of exhortation, because the other great difficulty for the people of Israel wandering through the desert all this time is that they can start to think that the wilderness was what God had redeemed them for, not even to seek to enter into the promised land. It'd be like living in a trailer while you build your $13 mansion in the Southlands, $13 million mansion. The Southlands, $13, wow. You're living in a trailer while your mansion's built, and then the building's done, but you just stay living in the trailer? Say, no, I want to keep sleeping in a sleeping bag and eating from tin cans. That's probably better than anything out there. No. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said that what leads us into all kinds of sin and trouble is not that our passions are too great, but that they're too weak. By that he means too easily satisfied. It's a very real danger for us if we've been Christians for a long time, and Jesus continues to maintain this holding pattern while more sheep come into the fold. There's a real danger that we can begin to become far too comfortable with our present surroundings. Start living and investing our time, talent, and treasure as though this life is all there is. Put another way, we could start to set up shop on the wrong side of the Jordan River. And the exhortation from this passage for us today, for Israel then and for us today, is, hey, don't get comfortable, bro. Don't get comfortable. Yes, enjoy the present provision and salvation that you have right now. Be satisfied with that, but don't start living like that's all there is. Never forget, I haven't redeemed you for the desert. I've redeemed you for a far, far better place. I don't know, I think we can all appreciate how difficult it was for Israel to comprehend that they were presently in possession of. They were owners of a land that they had never yet even set foot in. It's hard, but I think we can appreciate it because that's exactly where we are right now. As I said, we're in the exact same place today. But for all the similarities between Israel then and for us today, it needs to be said that there's one key difference. One key difference, and that difference centers around this greater star of Christmas that we've been talking about this morning. Because of the approximately 1 million people who walked out of Egypt, who walked through the Red Sea and were wandering in the desert for 40 years, guess how many of that first generation made it into the promised land? 2. Joshua and Caleb. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul tells us in the New Testament that the rest of that first generation died in the wilderness, never set one foot into the promised land. And Paul also tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 that this story, this grand story of Israel, is written down for us as a warning not to set our hearts on evil like they did. And then he adds very tellingly right after, do not be idolaters. Idolaters, or those who set up and worship anything, even good things in their lives, above God. Because you see, although God had revealed himself as the true light, as the true king, through the covenants, through the giving of the law in the Old Testament, as well as revealing himself most supremely in Jesus in the New Testament, we see that Israel still rejected God as their king. And in rejecting the king, they lost the inheritance of the king. That's why Jesus, this greater star of Christmas, is so essential. The Bible tells us that it's through putting our faith in him alone, it's in swearing allegiance to his kingly rule alone, that we inherit that promised kingdom. The zoomed out picture of Israel, the story of them, shows us that without embracing the king, we have no hope for the promised kingdom. You know, there's been many Christians like John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Or the writers of the Negro Spirituals of the South, who have pictured Israel crossing over the Jordan into the Promised Land as a picture of death, a final obstacle that we face before entering into the promised rest of God. And the hope we have as we face the immense darkness of life's greatest enemy, death, as well as whatever other struggles we face today, presently, is that Jesus Christ, this greater star of Christmas, this light of life, he faced and conquered death for us. He faced and conquered the darkness of death for us, so that as we look to him, he can now reveal the way through the darkness of the river into that promised rest. He can do that because Jesus doesn't just shine a light and light the way through the darkness. He also is the way through it. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. The light shines brightly in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I pray for each one of you that you see and follow that light today. Let's pray.